We're talking about Jesus and how things would kind of come along to shake him off his schedule, where he'd have a plan or he'd have a certain way he wanted his day to go, like we all do. And then something would come along and change all that. And for me, and I suspect for a lot of people, every time an interruption comes like that, I don't always handle it the very best. But Jesus' whole ministry seems to be characterized by that. He's constantly being approached by people who just need a word or need him to help them or need a quick hand, or even on the cross, he's being talked to by the guy beside him on another cross saying, Jesus, do you have just a minute? And he never reacts to that poorly. He always has time for people. In fact, people are his agenda. And to the extent that he has a plan, the plan seems to be there for people. And it's interesting. And the more you study him and the more you read into his life and see about his example, the more all of that sort of thing stands out. Well, in the book of Mark, the first chapter, it ends with Jesus healing some people. And it says that the news about Jesus started to spread all over the region. People were just talking about him because of these miracles. He could heal people. And just a word or a touch or just being in his presence was enough to make blind people see again, or deaf people to hear. He was affecting things, and it was affecting people to see Jesus move this way. And so he comes back into his home area there, into Galilee, and he goes to Capernaum, to a house there. It could have been Peter's house. Jesus will later say about himself that he has no place to lay his head. So maybe it's Peter's house, or maybe it's another friend there in Capernaum, and he's teaching. And it says the people heard he'd come home, and they gathered in such large numbers. There was no room. You couldn't even get to it. And he's just teaching them. He's just letting them know about the kingdom. And ultimately, that's why Jesus came, right? To tell about what God's doing and what God has in mind and how God is accomplished. Jesus could have been anything. As an adult, he could have been a farmer or a soldier or a lawyer or it didn't matter, a musician, right? But he chooses to teach. And most of his free time, you can find Jesus teaching about this new way of seeing the world, themes of equality and consent and compassion, things that have affected the whole world. That launched out from Jesus. Well, anyway, he's teaching, and nobody can get inside. Well, there's some fellas come along, and they bring a paralyzed man, and he's carried by 4 of them, and they couldn't get to Jesus because of the crowd. So not only could they not get in because of the crowd, but even when they show up and, hey, we've got a paralyzed man here, nobody's making way for him, right? It's like when you get a front row seat at whatever concert, you don't want to give that up to somebody else, and you're seeing some of that here, and they won't let him in. So they make an opening in the roof above Jesus, and they dig through it. And now it's not a roof like ours. It wouldn't have been plywood and nails, but mud and thatch. But still, some work getting that done. And it's not the kind of thing that would, like a trap door, like one minute there's a roof and the next minute it's wide open. It'd be a minute of clearing it away, right? And when everybody's aware downstairs what's going on, and you're still clearing it away. Here's 4 guys, his friends, that are not scared of being in the center of attention. And you can picture Jesus, he's teaching, he's making these points, and then he's like dust in his eyes, and he finally stops and looks up, and these guys are tearing the roof apart to come and see Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, and there certainly includes the paralyzed man, but it's his friends, right? It's the community faith. He says, son, your sins are forgiven. And you can imagine that the friends, the paralyzed man and his friends, are like, well, we didn't really come for that. Thanks. I think of the Caddyshack thing a long time ago, where Bill Murray says he had met the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama had promised him eternal consciousness when he died. Didn't give him a tip, but promised that. And he said, so I got that going for me, and you can picture that's what these guys, so we got that going for us, I guess. Forgiven sins, thanks, Jesus. But really looking more at his legs. That's you can picture that kind of, and it wasn't just those guys thinking it. Just the friends of the paralyzed man. It says some teachers of the law were sitting there, and they're thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like this? He's blaspheming. Only God can forgive sin. And that's kind of common knowledge, right? I mean, if you hurt me, I can forgive you for hurting me. Certainly I can do forgiveness and should do forgiveness. But I mean, when we talk about sin and those marks that we have against God in our ledger, only God can forgive that kind of stuff. And they hear Jesus talking this way, it just kind of ticks them off. And they don't challenge him on it out loud. They're just thinking it to themselves. But Jesus, he knows what they're thinking. And so Jesus initiates the conflict. These guys didn't really do anything. They're thinking it, but they aren't doing anything. And they aren't, and Jesus sees it and he initiates the conflict. He's a troublemaker is what he is. Why are you thinking these things? He says, which is easier, to say to the paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? Well, I mean, in terms of metaphysically, which one's easier? Probably healing physical is easier than healing spiritual. But in terms of what people would see and think and do it, well, obviously it's easier to say your sins are forgiven because you can't prove it. I can speak to the camera and say, hey, your sins are forgiven. But there's no gas gauge on a person's heart where we can look and say, oh, he was full of sin, now he's not. It doesn't work that way. So you can't really prove that one. That one's all kind of in our head. But this idea of walking, for a guy who came in paralyzed, for him to walk, well, yeah, I mean, that's a big deal. And he says, I want you to know. I want you to know the Son of Man has authority. Keep in mind, Jesus has initiated the conflict. I mean, these guys have torn the roof up, and there's a conflict with that too, right? I mean, the roof owner is not going to be happy about it if nobody else cares. But so there's been some tension already in the air, and Jesus has said this thing out loud that's made people nervous, and probably made the friends of the paralyzed man say, "Well, okay, great," but it's Jesus that initiates the conflict. He's the one who challenges, and he's the one who puts the proposal on the table. Well, why don't I just prove that I can do it? That's what he's doing. I want you to know, he says, that I have authority to forgive sins. And so he says to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. And he did. He got up, took his mat, and he walked out in full view of all of them. And it amazed everyone. And they praised God. We've never seen anything like this. Okay, let's think through a couple different things here about what that story might be teaching us and what that story might have to say. First of all, for the paralyzed man and his friends, but for the paralyzed man especially, you could picture him that morning, and they're getting him out of bed and they're putting him on a blanket to take him to Jesus, and he's saying it's not going to work. We're just wasting our time. Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, because you get your hopes up, right, and then down, and hopes up, and then it falls apart. And here's a guy probably who has tried other medical things, and it doesn't work. And he's tried other means of cure, and nothing seems to fix it. And he's always disappointed. But these friends believe, no, this guy's going to be able to do it for you. Or maybe it's the other way. Maybe he has all the hope, and the friends don't really believe it, but they love this guy. And so anyway, they're going to see Jesus. And there's got to be some doubt in their head if it'll work, because that's how life is. And they get to the house, and they can't even get him in. But the friends don't give up. They go upstairs, and they're literally clawing at the hard dirt with their hands, the dried mud, and it's like concrete, and they're just ripping it apart. They want so badly to see their friend get healing. And they lower him in there, and Jesus starts with what he starts with, and sins forgiven, and they aren't that, great, but look at his legs. And then he does heal the legs, and these guys all leave together. People are still back in the background saying, we've never seen, but these guys, they've all walked out. Maybe they meet together, and they're throwing a ball around, or they're wrestling with each other, things that they just could never have done. This guy, he never could do those things. Maybe they run all the way home. I think I might want to do that if I hadn't been able to walk in. And so they're all sitting around and maybe having a drink together afterward, or just kind of relaxing in the shade. And the former paralyzed man says to the other guys, what do you think all that meant? And they say, what? Well, I mean, that part about my sins being forgiven. And one friend might say, what do you care? You're healed, Well, no, I mean, but what's that mean? And he starts to think about it, and he knows it's real, because if Jesus could heal his legs, then he certainly could heal his heart. And what's that mean? I don't feel any different. Well, maybe it means that you're okay with God now. I mean, all the stuff you did in the past, it's all over. And Maybe you're square. Yeah, maybe it's, I don't know, who cares? You can walk, but he does care and he thinks about it. And Jesus does all this because he says, I want you to know. I want you to know. There's going to be a danger in future years that people will say, I was just a good teacher. And I want you to know I was much more than that. They might say that even I did some miracles, fed 5,000 or walked on water, and that's cool. But I want you to know I can do more than that. He can forgive you. That's a pretty powerful thing. That's worth thinking about today.